It's that they're giving you, they're really giving you something that belongs to you.
Hi, David.
There. Sorry, I was muted. How are you?
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Very much looking forward.
Thank you very much.
What's your background in general with the Ramchal?
I guess when I was 19 is when I was introduced to the Ramchal, and then I went to graduate school, Yeshiva University, and learned that he was controversial, and I thought that was interesting. And then I decided to get a PhD and write the dissertation about him. So,
your thesis was about the Ramchal himself?
Yes.
Oh, amazing! Oh, wow, that's huge. Okay, fantastic. Very much looking forward then.
Thank you. So, is this? Can you tell me just a little bit about the synagogue or about the series or anything?
Sure. What would you like to know? I'll tell you all about it.
I mean, we're starting in 3 minutes, so you can tell me in 30 seconds, whatever you like.
We
I'm just curious.
Based in Vancouver. We are a small Sephardic synagogue. We have approximately 100 or so families connected with us.
To me, that's huge. I grew up with a Sephardic minyan, and we were like 12 families.
You're in New York right now?
I live in New York, but I grew up in Minnesota.
Right. So they established a synagogue, I think, was it last year or 2 years ago? We actually did celebrate our 50th anniversary. So it's a bit of a cholent, if you want, mind the Ashkenazic term, but we've got people from all around. It's such a beautiful, broader collection of people. Each one adds their own spice, and that's, I think, the beautiful part of it. Hi, Ellen. I think that's one of our biggest assets, if you want. And we have such a broad range of also different types of people, different dynamics. History has always been a very strong thing, underlaying piece of everyone. And last week, I think was it last week or 2 weeks ago? We had Dr. Lieberman.
Right. He's great. He
was fantastic. And we said, all right, we're going to look forward to the next one. So, here you are, and it's amazing. I'm actually really looking forward, because Ramchal was one of those, cornerstones of Judaism, and controversial, as we know. And I'm looking forward to hear the.
Right. So this is a series about controversy, correct?
That's right. This is Richard Wood, who contacted you originally. He's the one who decided to go ahead with this particular topic. So I think I love it, and I think the rest of the people on the Zoom who will be coming will also love it. I must tell you that it's a Sunday over here, as it is for you. But I don't know how many people are coming on today, but we post our videos on YouTube, and I've heard from a few people they really like the if they can't make it this time, they can make it afterwards. So.
All right, very good. And to me, it doesn't matter at all. I'm happy to be here.
Really appreciate that. Thank you for your time, and looking forward.
Thank you.
Okay, just gonna wait for people to come on.
Okay. Are you gonna be able to set it up for me so I can share my screen?
Yes, let me do that right now. Don't waste any time. You should be able to do it now. Can you do it? Yeah.
Yeah. Did it work?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, so I'll stop for a second.
Okay, people are coming in. There we go. We'll just give it another 2 minutes for other people to come in.
No.
Hi, Mary. No, Mary.
Hi, Sam.
That's not Mary. That's Annie.
Rabbi, let's wait 3 more minutes. More people are coming.
People are still coming in.
How's
Yeah.
Albert? How is Albert?
Fine. I'm muting. Too many people on.
I know he doesn't like the crowds. Also, this is going to last more than 1.5 minutes, too. Could be lengthy.
David, you excuse us for Sephardic time.
Not at all. I'm used to it, and I'm usually a participant.
Yeah, people are still coming on.
I guess that wasn't my Mary, Rabbi.
Come again, Sam?
I guess that was not my Mary.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, I think we're going to start. So hello and welcome everyone to our second episode of Sephardic Controversial Episodes. Special thanks to Richard Wood for putting this together. We've had some really fascinating, incredible discussions and talks following our last episode, and stay tuned for our next one next week. Please God. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. David Sklar, who is a research fellow at Harvard University and a history instructor at the Frisch School. He studies Jewish history and culture in the early modern period, focused on book history, the social history of and art studies. He is on a book on the life thoughts of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Mutzato, the Ramchal, and the project on religion. Just had a pleasure of speaking to him for a couple of minutes, and David just told me his thesis for his doctorate was actually based on the controversy of the Ramchal. So I'm actually very much looking forward to hearing a little bit about the Ramchal. The Ramchal was, as we'll hear in a minute, one of the greatest Italian Sephardic scholars. Ramchal was at the time in his lifetime had a very controversial life, but funnily enough, the Gaon Mivilna, who was at the time the primary Gadol B'Yisrael, if you want, said after reading his works, the Ramchal, and David maybe will be able to back me up with this. I think they say that the Gaon, the Vilna Gaon, said about him that if he would have the opportunity to have lived in his lifetime or to be able to see him, he would have walked from Vilna to learn by the Ramchal's feet. So that just tells you about the greatness of the Ramchal. Ramchal was one of the greatest Kabbalists, and today, in fact, years later, Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, the father of the Muslim movement, actually established the Ramchal's books as the primary Musar books, if you want, in Lithuanian Torah Jewry in the yeshiva world. And so Ramchal has such a strong impact on Torah Jewry today, and we are lucky to be connected somewhat to him by virtue of being Sephardi. We're very proud of that. And David, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I actually have a question. My father said he wants to sign on, and he says he can't because there's something saying something about what's bothering Rashi. Does that sound familiar, or perhaps he has the wrong room?
He's on the wrong Zoom.
Okay,
Richard, can you send him the current Zoom link? I'll send to you.
Oh, I see. He used one that was on the poster.
Oh, that's strange.
Sorry,
Okay.
one moment. I'm very sorry.
Let me give you 1 second. Let me send you the other one. Richard, I just sent it on the group. Can you send it to David again?
I think I have it here. I'm going to send it. I'm sorry for the delay.
No worries.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much. I should start a few things to start with. The one is that I might explode some of the myths about Ramchal, but not in any shocking way. It'll be more about just how what happens when you study history and look for actual documentation. But it'll all relate to everything that you just presented. The second thing that I wanted to tell you is just in terms of how I teach. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share in a moment. I could present this to anybody to a certain extent, but I really like to speak to people in the room, whether it's virtually or otherwise, which means I don't mind taking questions in the midst, especially if there's something that's unclear. And particularly related to Ramchal, there's so much depth and so much complexity that if it seems that there's something that's most interesting to people, I can definitely steer it in a particular direction. So what I have is something planned, but I'm also open, if there are questions in the midst of it. Okay, so I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Can everybody see this? Okay. Sorry, one moment. Okay. Hold on 1 second, I'm sorry. Okay, so you might have seen this image from the poster. This is a mural, or was a mural, I don't know if it actually still exists, that was painted in Akko in Israel. This is not what the Ramchal looked like. It's not even close. But partly what we are going to be dealing with is the fact that there's a distinction between who a person is in the time that they're actually living and who they become through whatever they publish, through their works and how they're received. It's something called reception history. what you'll see here, this is a signature where it says Moshe Chaim Lutzato, that actually is a very good representation of what his handwriting looked like when he wrote his name. Wearing the turban and everything else is unlikely what he looked like, certainly for the vast majority of his life. And we'll get to all of that. Hold on, make sure that I get this right. Okay, now what Rabbi Gabai mentioned is that famously Ramchal, there are these stories that are ascribed to the Gra, and there's also something coming to the Maggid and Mezrich. Ramchal has been seen in terms of his reception as a great figure and a father of main primary modern Jewish movements. You've got Moses Mendelssohn here in the sense that the understanding that Ramchal was an influence on the Enlightenment, particularly through his the poetry that he wrote, and he's regarded to some extent as the father of modern Hebrew literature. There's also these notions that the Maggid of Mezrich said that the Ramchal died at a young age. He died at 39 because the world wasn't ready for him. This is an image that's frequently regarded as being the Baal Shem Tov. It's actually not. It's the Baal Shem of London, whose name was Shmuel Falk. But I put it there anyway, just so you can get the point that this is, we're sort of going through these major movements that began in the 18th century. And then the Gra, this is also a question as to whether the Gra actually looked like this. What Rabbi Gabai brought up as to what the Gra said about Ramchal, this I've actually never been able to practically trace. The statement of the Maggid of Mezrich that Ramchal died at a very young age because the world wasn't ready for him, that I could trace it sort of like secondhand. A student of the Maggid did make this claim that he heard it directly from the Maggid. The issue from the Vilna Gaon is something else, but having said that, Ramchal became this enormous figure, especially for the Musar movement in Lithuania in the 19th century. This all should be understood as the rise of a figure named Ramchal. In Judaism, in traditional Judaism, we have this understanding. Frequently, the rabbis are known by their books. So the Chafetz Chaim is an example. That wasn't this person's name. And we actually see the same thing when we look at Yosef Karo, for instance, specifically. He can be referred to by a number of different Sfarim that he actually published. And so Ramchal is somebody who, once the work was published, he became sort of a part of the pantheon, and it grew, and he was so important beginning in the 19th century. I should make the point right now that he lived somewhere between 1706 and 1746. The birth and the death dates are a little bit unclear, but his rise and his sort of this power of this Ramchal, this was established in really in the beginning, in the middle of the 19th century. So for instance, just to give you some stats to understand the extent of his sort of his authority, in Mesilat Yesharim, which became the most influential work coming from Ramchal, which is the particular book that Rabbi Gabai mentioned, was that Yisrael Salanter used for the development of the Musar movement in Lithuania. It appeared in 7 editions in Vilna between 1844 and 1875, and in approximately 25 editions in Warsaw between 1841 and 1895. If you can just imagine the number of editions, meaning this is a book that is constantly being printed, to such an extent that in Königsberg in 1858 and 1859, there were 5 editions. And it wasn't just a single printer, but between 1857 and 1869, you're looking at approximately 10 printers who are publishing more than 20 editions of Ramchal's works in 6 different cities. So you can see that by the mid-19th century, this person, or this figure of Ramchal, has exploded. And it's exploded in the sense of printing. However, the question is, who was this individual? He lived, as I say here, between 1706 and 1746, maybe 47. He lived in northern Italy. You can see in this map here, Italy was really the Italian peninsula. There were multiple states. You have the Papal States. He lived in the Venetian Republic in the Veneto. There was no unified Italy until later in the 19th century. So you really are looking at the Italian peninsula as quite divided, but this also it didn't just mean this politically, but it also meant it culturally, and it also was important and significant when it came to the Jewish communities. There's never really been a single Jewish community, but rather an understanding that we have autonomous Jewish communities that are deeply connected. And that was the case that he essentially was raised in, but the divisions also mattered, which we will get to in a second. So he was the son of a merchant and a communal leader. His name was Yaakov Chai Luzzato, who came from Venice. He and his brother arrived from Venice to Padua in the 1710s. But before that, because Ramchal was born in 1706. Now, Ramchal was, before he became the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzato he was clearly an exceptional child. Excelled at both Jewish and secular subjects. He was privately tutored. By the time he was a teenager, he was studying medicine at the University of Padua. Each of these things can be sort of its own lecture to a certain extent. So if anybody has questions at the end, or even now, I can go a little bit into it. Padua itself was an ancient Jewish community. It was politically a part of the Venetian Republic, but the Jewish community was distinct from the Venetian Republic, from the Venetian Jewish community. In Padua, you had about 800 Jews at this time in the early 18th century, which is a medium-sized Jewish community. In Venice, in contrast, there were upwards of 5,000 Jews. But even having said that, you're not really looking at a single Venetian Jewish community at the time. There were distinct communities. You had an Ashkenazi community. You had an Italian community, meaning Italian being indigenous Italian Jews who didn't trace their lineage back to Sfarad, meaning Iberia, or to Ashkenaz, meaning Franco-Germany. So these were Jews who had been in Italy. Their families had been in Italy. So you had an Italian congregation. You had an Ashkenazic congregation. You had two different Sephardic congregations. So Venice consisted of distinct communities to a certain extent. And there were so many Jews that that made sense. In Padua, with 800, which is 800 Jews, and there was a medium-sized community, you were looking more at a unified community. There was a Sephardic congregation, there was an Ashkenazi congregation and an Italian congregation, but politically speaking, they were a single unit. And Ramchal was born to a family that was particularly important from the sort of political and secular side of the community. Having said that, his family, he did not descend from any rabbinic tradition. And there were no rabbis in the community. They were in his family, pardon me. They were merchants, his father, the uncles, and so on. Anyway, as a young boy, he authored poetry, dramatic works, and he also published something. The first thing he published was something published on Limudim, which was a treatise on the Hebrew language. But he himself was seen as this Ilui, as this extremely, sort of as this prodigy. And you can imagine how he was regarded very highly within the community. First of all, because of who his family was, how they were situated, being both wealthy and connected, so to speak, and also because of his talent. So, for instance, in 1729, so this is already after what becomes a controversy, which we'll get to in a second, he authored and put together this service for Chanukat Aaron, where this sort of, how do you describe it? It was like an inauguration of the Sephardic synagogue in Padua, in the ghetto. And this is actually the Aron HaKodesh from that synagogue in Padua, and you might have seen it before, being that it's a pleasure to actually speak to a Sephardic congregation, because I grew up with a Sephardic minyan, and the Sidurim and the Machzorim that we used had this on the cover. It's from a yeshiva in Jerusalem called Or Yisrael, and this was transferred to Jerusalem, to Heichal Shlomo in Jerusalem. You might now, once you see this machzor, if you have it in your synagogue or not, I don't know, you might recognize this. In any event, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was the one who sort of put together the service for the inauguration of the new Sephardic synagogue in 1729. Now, besides his sort of social and political situation, at the age of possibly around his bar mitzvah, it's very difficult to tell, but he started studying Kabbalah. He sort of swallowed everything whole, and the chief rabbi of Padua at the time was named Isaiah Bassan, and Moshe Chaim became his student to a certain extent, but he also was driven on his own, and he simply delved into all the Kabbalistic material he could find. In the process of his adolescence, he sort of regarded himself in this line of succession from Isaiah Bassan to, before him, a rabbi named Binyamin Cohen Vitale, who was in Reggio Emilia, which is also in northern Italy, and before Binyamin Cohen Vitale, Moshe Zakut. Some of you may have heard of Moshe Zakuto. So if I actually go back for a second, you'll notice here on the map, Padua is here in the Veneto. Here's Venice. If you were to take a train now from Venice to Padua, it takes 25 minutes. Reggio Emilia is somewhere up here, and Mantua is here, which is like a 2-hour train ride. Mantua is a part of the Duchy of Mantua, so politically it's distinct from the Venetians, but Jews being autonomous, or these communities being relatively autonomous, there is sort of a cross-cultural and cross-political boundary relationship, and there was an Italian Hasidism, in essence, this pietism that was basically taking Kabbalah to the people. How that happened is sort of, I can go into it if anybody's interested, but it meant that young Moshe Chaim saw himself as part of this line. In 1724, he joined a Kabbalistic confraternity, which is a confraternity is sort of a small group of people studying. He joined this Kabbalistic confraternity called Mivakshei Hashem. They studied Kabbalah. There were only maybe 4 of them. It's very difficult to tell the exact number, but we know at least 4 people who were involved. They studied Kabbalah intensively and frequently, not only, meaning they had at least 2 of them. One of them was a physician. One, besides Moshe Chaim, he was at the university studying. The others had jobs, but they spent much time studying Kabbalah, studying especially the work of Isaac Luria and Moshe Zakut, who had been they were sort of the 4th generation of this Italian line. So they studied Kabbalah in a room separate from one of the main, from sort of the main Beit Midrash of the Ashkenazic synagogue. I should have mentioned this before. Technically speaking, Ramchal was not the Sephardic at all. His family was Ashkenazic. The family, Luzzatto family, had come from Germany probably in the late 15th, early 16th century, like many Ashkenazic Jews had come to northern Italy. However, many of the people in what became this group, in this Kabbalistic group, were Sephardic. Now, in 1727, something changed within the group. He was now 20, and he saw himself in quite a different way than the rest. He was no longer sort of the student of some of the others. And this group, Mevakshei Hashem, it sort of folded and reformed in the Luzzatto house as a new group with Ramchal, with Moshe Chaim Luzzatto as the center of it. This is we're going to read a text together in a second. This group that now reformed was no longer just the group of 4 or 5 people. It was now something that was going to grow. There was going to be a main core of, let's say, 7, but they were going to open it up where this chevra became more of a yeshiva. but it involved Kabbalah and it involved the Messianism. One of the people who joined this group was a man named Yekutiel Gordon of Vilna. He had come from Vilna to Padua to study medicine. I should have mentioned that the University of Padua was the first university in Europe to accept Jews to study anything, and they studied medicine. So Yekutiel Gordon had come from Vilna to Padua to study, and in the process of studying, being that he's living there in the ghetto, he got to know Moshe Chaim, and he essentially sort of moved his desires or intentions towards this Kabbalistic activity that Moshe Chaim had started. So in 1729, he sends a letter. He sends actually two letters to two people. One is to a rabbi in Vilna who he knew, and the other is to a businessman, and possibly rabbi in Vienna named Mordechai Jaffe. And this is what he says. So here we are. We're going to start. I'm going to read pretty quickly, but it'll give you an idea of what was taking place. I do not know you. So Gordon is writing to a man he doesn't know. I do not know you, but I've heard your name, which is known in all gates. So the rabbinic, by the way, if we were to read this in Hebrew, you'd see it's extremely sort of flowery. It is therefore becoming to reveal to you a divine decree, only part of it, because the whole could not be completely expressed in one letter. So in other words, he's writing to him to express, he's going to share something amazing with him. In short, I want to tell you, sir, what a great light has been granted to us by God, blessed be he. We have here, namely, a youth, 23 years old, who is a holy man. It is my master and teacher, a godly man, whose revered name is Moshe Chaim Lutzato. Behold, 2.5 years ago, a Magid appeared to him, a holy and awful angel who revealed to him wonderful secrets. Now, a Magid there's a long tradition for this. A Magid is, in essence, a heavenly voice that a human being can commune with, and the Magid will reveal some sort of secrets. The questions are, is it an angel? The questions are, what does it reveal? All of those things, it can appear in different ways. It's a whole long story. The most famous Magid to ever appear was the Magid of Yosef Karo, the author of Shulchan Aruch, and he sort of wrote a diary of it, and it was published. Some of it was published, called Magid Mesharim. And so when this says that Moshe Chaim has this Magid, there's a tradition for this thing. That means that he's revealing that this young man has these revelations. At an earlier period, when only 14 years old, he already knew all the writings of the Ari, that is Isaac Luria, but he was hiding this thing without telling it to his father or anyone in the world, meaning that according to Yekutiel Gordon, Ramchal hasn't told anybody about this Magid, or almost anybody, because obviously Gordon knows about it. He has in him a spark of Akiva ben Yosef, Akiva being the famous Rabbi Akiva of the Mishnah. When it says that he has a spark, it means that he regards himself as being a reincarnation. I should mention very quickly now that the core of this group that had reformed in Lutzato House, they saw themselves as as bringing out the Messianic movement. It was the Messianic moment. It was going to be manifest with them. And each of the main members of the group had some specific spiritual part to play. And they had different souls that they understood themselves as having been reincarnations of. And Ramchal is the one who was at the top, at the apex. He regarded, this sort of gets, from other sources, we understand that he regarded himself as a reincarnation of Moses, of Moshe Rabbeinu. One of the other people, Moshe David Vale, who was a physician and sort of the top Kabbalist before Ramchal became the center of this. He was supposed to be Mashiach ben David. He was supposed to be the Messiah. But they had this understanding of Messianism where the Moses was at the apex as the revealer, and Mashiach ben David was involved in doing one aspect and the other. Each person had a part to play. Okay, so he sees himself as this. He has this spark of Akiva ben Yosef. And behold, 8 months ago, a holy and awful angel appeared and revealed to him many secrets and formulas, enabling him to bring down from heaven the heavenly academy. He ordered him also, with the approval of the Lord, blessed be he, and of his Shekhinah, to write out a new Zohar. which book was named by the heavenly authority Zohar Tinyana. So basically, Ramchal is now, from his Magi, taking almost dictation. He has these revelations. That's what this is. That's what Yekutiel Gordon is saying. The procedure is as follows. This angel speaks out of his mouth, but we, his disciples, hear nothing whatsoever. This is something called endophagia, which is distinct from, let's say, what Yosef Karo apparently was said to have. There's something called automatic writing or automatic speech. It's when somebody gets into a state, and this is what he's describing. And the angel first reveals to him wondrous secrets. Then our master orders Elijah to come down at once. The latter comes and tells us new secrets of his own, meaning there's different revealers. Sometimes Metatron himself, the great prince of heaven, arrives, also the true shepherd, which is supposed to refer to Moshe Rabbeinu, grandfather Abraham, which is the soul of Abraham Avinu, and sometimes the king Messiah and the God-man. Each of these souls means something in particular. And behold, he has already finished one commentary on Kohelet, a wondrous and awe-inspiring work. Now he has ordered to compose 70 tikkunim, explaining only the final verse of the Torah. And this idea of the final verse is because of the final revelation. This is sort of the end. He also wrote 3 books on Torah, all 3 embracing only one small portion, and Jacob went out. All this in a Kabbalistic, awe-inspiring way, and everything in the language of the Zohar, meaning that he's writing in Aramaic, which was regarded as not holier than Hebrew, but a language of secrets. He also knows all the transmigrations of the souls and the requirements of every man's soul for purification. Transmigration referred to Gilgul, or reincarnation, and he will reveal this to people and also express what each person's tikkun or rectification that their soul is supposed to perform. In a word, there is nothing hidden from him. Okay, this is a major statement to make this claim about a 23-year-old, writing to somebody he doesn't know. At first, the Maggid was permitted to tell him only the secrets of the Torah, but now he tells him everything, and no one knows of it except us, his disciples. Ramchal told me a great secret with reference to the reason for my coming over here to keep him company in his studies, because there is nothing without a reason. And in other words, Yekutiel Gordon we have other references to what his life was like in Padua, and he says that Ramchal revealed to him the reason that he's really there. He also told me my soul's relationships and what was required for this purification, and it is an ordinary thing for the faithful shepherd and for the Metatron, the Prince of Heaven, to speak of him in connection with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, author of the Zohar, and to compare him with the latter in every respect. Okay, such and such. In other words, Yekutiel Gordon is drawing a direct connection from Shimon Bar Yochai, who they regarded as the author of the Zohar, and then in other context, we have text where it shows that Isaac Luria, who was the great Kabbalist in the 16th century, was sort of on the next major figure in this line. And then Ramchal is sort of this final chain of redemption, this Kabbalistic redemption. So this is what Yekutiel Gordon writes. And he's writing to somebody he doesn't know, and he's writing about a 23-year-old. I should mention that Ramchal at this time is not married, and these are major claims. It's not a huge thing to say that somebody has a Maggid, but it is a major thing to say that there's a 23-year-old who somehow has a Maggid. So the question is, how is this received? It is not received well at all. Mordechai Jaffe sends a letter to somebody named Moshe Chajiz, who we'll get to in a second, saying this is extremely disconcerting. This sounds like what's called Sabbatianism. And Sabbatianism, in a very short, because there's so much to talk about, I'll have to just go very quickly. Sabbatianism, basically the concern is that in the 1660s, Shabtai Tzvi, who you have an image here of, was this famed Messiah. And 90% of the world jury was sure that this was it. Here's the Messiah, except that it ultimately turned out not to work out because although Shabtai Tzvi was extremely charismatic and people were even turned to piety, and many rabbis were, they feared discouraging the piety, even if the enthusiasm was dangerous, because it meant that people were becoming more spiritual and more religious. But ultimately, Shabtai Tzvi was given an ultimatum by the Sultan when he was within the Ottoman Empire that he would convert to Islam or he'd have to perform a miracle or he'd die. And Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam, which ended the overt element of the movement. However, there was such a concern, or there was such a conviction that Shabtai Tzvi had been the Messiah, that there was an underground movement that continued, and it evolved for decades, and it went straight into the 1720s and 30s, and actually straight through into the 19th century, where within Rabbinic Judaism, the concern was there was a standing concern of heresy, that there is some subterranean movement that is going to sort of corrupt Judaism, which in fact it was, but it appeared in different capacities, and it's hard to exactly explain what Sabbatianism was supposed to be at the time. There's probably not a single thing. But the main concern for Mordechai Jaffe was, here's this guy, whoever Yekutiel Gordon is talking about, this is dangerous. This is new messianism. This is a real problem because we can't control this. And he could be lying. He could lead to other who knows what could happen here. This is more about Shabtai Tzvi and Sabbatianism, which I think that because of the time we'll have to skip, and I can come back to if you're interested. So what Jaffe did was to send this letter to a man in Hamburg named Moshe, or Altona in Hamburg named Moshe Chagiz. Chagiz essentially was a self-proclaimed heresy hunter. He made it his, he was the son of Chacham Tzvi in Amsterdam. He made it his, he was not the son, sorry, he was the brother-in-law. He made it his, sort of his life's mission to root out heresy. And he turned immediately to Venice, which was the major Jewish community in Italy at the time. And he wrote, for instance, "Ye mountains of Israel, my teachers and masters, upon you, the wise men, the rabbis, and the leaders of the community. The duty rests, after having rent your clothes in mourning, to investigate and to uproot this wicked company, before it propagates its wickedness among the ignorant mass of the people, and to condemn all members thereof as enemies of Israel." The assumption immediately was that Luzzatto was a Sabbatianist, that the entire group was engaged in acts of heresy and corruption, and that because Chagiz was in Altona and Hamburg, that it was up to the rabbis in Venice to do something about this. Some of the issues of this concern, like I had mentioned, were that Luzzatto was so young, that his appearance mattered. He learned that the young Ramchal did not have a beard, and this was something that just sort of didn't compute with the notion of what a Kabbalist was supposed to be. And he also was not married, meaning how could all of these claims that Gordon is making actually be true? The question ultimately within the Italian peninsula was, what is the role of Venice in this particular case? As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the Venetians, Venice consists of multiple congregations. There's not a single rabbinate. You do have rabbis, and you do have a sort of what was called a yeshiva klalit, where there was sort of a board of rabbis, but they ultimately did not all agree with what was supposed to take place. And there was also a concern, well, I should start by saying this. Chagiz just assumed that Venice, the Venetian Republic, is responsible. Padua it exists within the polity of the Venetian Republic, and the Venetian rabbinate therefore must have control over the Padua rabbinate. But as far as Padua was concerned, this wasn't the case. And even for Venetian jury, the question was whether this was true or not. In any event, there was a sort of a back and forth, and there were Venetian rabbis who went and investigated. They went to Padua. There were other Italian rabbis who went and investigated, and there were constant accusations of heresy. The main, there were sort of three responses. One, along the lines of Chagiz and another person in Venice. There was one rabbi in particular named Isaac Pacifico. His concern, their stance on this was, they must be banned completely. They must be uprooted. These are heretics. Then there was another concern, that there was another line of thought, which was simply, let's be cautious with this. We don't want to disturb anything. We don't exactly know what's going on in Padua, because perhaps there really is a rise in piety and that they aren't Sabbatianists. But we want to make sure that nothing gets out about this, and we don't want to disturb the peace, so to speak. And therefore, let's talk to the young Moshe Chaim and see what can be done about whatever is taking place here. And then there were those in Italy who actually, especially in Mantua, who were part of that Italian Hasidism that I had mentioned early, who started to think, okay, maybe there really is a moment of messianism now, and maybe what Yekutiel Gordon is talking about is true, and who is this Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and what is the actual truth? How do we ascertain the veracity of this? In the end, although there was some discovery of supposedly a black candle and a broken mirror and things like this, things that were supposed to be indicate heresy, Ramchal signed an oath to end what was by then the initial part of a controversy, this uproar, and he swore to cease teaching and writing Kabbalah, and especially writing in Aramaic. And that sort of put things to rest. The issue, of course, was that it didn't actually put the group to rest. Ramchal really saw himself as the reincarnation of Moshe Rabbeinu. They really saw the group itself, the core members really saw themselves as devoted to this, to both to the study and the propagation of Kabbalah, but also to the manifestation of this messianic vision. And they drew up protocols. And this was probably in 1731. So if that oath was signed around 1730, Yekutiel Gordon's letter was sent in 1729, so then the oath was signed in 1730. The group actually in Padua, although the controversy itself seems to have sort of died down, the group itself actually became more intensive in its focus. So the protocols begin this way. These are the elements of the covenant. So they actually are drawing up a brit. The decrees, the statutes, and the teachings, this is biblical language, that the holy colleagues have come together to establish and uphold for the sake of the Holy One, blessed be He, in His presence. This is the Kabbalistic formulation, L'shem yichu kudsha v'lichu shlinte. We do so as to be one man to perform this work, the service of God. And then they give sort of 10, a list of protocols. Then there are signatures for the core group, and then there's another list of 10 protocols for additional signatures. Because what was taking place here was that there was now going to be this core of 7 who were devoted completely to studying Kabbalah, somebody being in the yeshiva at all moments studying. And but they would also expand this to the rest of the community and allow for anybody sort of to come, as long as they were going to join with pure intention, this idea of becoming one, abiding by what the rules are of the group and committed to what Ramchal's vision was. This continued for a number of years. Ramchal got married. He married the daughter of the chief rabbi of Mantua. His name was David Finzi, and his daughter's name was Tzipora. So here you had a Moshe marrying Tzipora, like the biblical Moses marrying Tzipora. And his group, Moshe Chaim, and the group itself saw that as the exact moment of redemption. And that was in 1731. And over the next few years, Ramchal wrote different types of work, all related to Kabbalah and to spreading this sort of his vision. Now, the main thing to understand here is that he wanted, in essence, to bring not the intricacies of Kabbalah to the general population, because that's extremely difficult and virtually impossible. What he wanted to do was to bring the spirit of it to anybody and everybody. But that was why it was ultimately seen as dangerous, because it meant that he was teaching Kabbalah and speaking of things that, in essence, involved a change of society. It was a pietism and an enthusiasm that meant that all sort of our understanding of normative Judaism and normative communal activity simply it wouldn't matter anymore because it was the Messianic moment. So in 1734, Ramchal he attempted to publish something in Venice. Opponents in Venice got wind of it. They sort of, in essence, refused to allow this. They didn't exactly chase him out of Venice, but they made it extremely difficult for him. And he, by then, had already, this is 1734, was starting to think, well, if this isn't working, if my group is fine just in Padua, but I'm not able to spread this any further and I need to print, then perhaps I need to go somewhere else, specifically to Amsterdam. Amsterdam was another center of Jewish culture, and it was the place that people would go from, even from North Africa, to go and try and publish, because you could be, it was the center of Jewish printing. The controversy then basically was sparked again in 1734, 35, and 36, when Ramchal made his way to, he decided to go to Amsterdam in the dead of winter. So actually, let's see, if you can imagine here, this is Venice. He crossed the Alps in December or January. We do have evidence of people crossing the Alps, the Grand Tour in the 18th century in Europe, but very few people would attempt to do this in the winter. It seems that he simply, the situation for him in Italy was untenable, so he then stopped in Frankfurt on the way to Amsterdam, and while he was in Frankfurt, he in essence he was accused of a number of issues, all again related to this concern about Sabbatianism and the heresy, and his work was, his writings were confiscated. It was led by Yaakov Poppers, who was an associate of Moshe Chajiz and Ezekiel Katzenellenbogen, and Luzzatto, the Ramchal, at that point had to sign another oath, and he turned over his writings, and they were ultimately buried. Again, even in this second round of things, there was a concern all about the youthfulness, this immaturity, impiety. But the thing is that Ramchal, he returned the accusations. He had done the same early on, saying the rabbis they're not truly pious because they're not attempting to do what I am doing, and they don't truly understand. And he referred in his own writings to certain people. He would refer to the rabbis as sheep or as superficial, only looking for power and that sort of thing. And after his arrival in Frankfurt, and with what sort of seemed like an ambush, he seemed as though he was defeated. During this period, there were at least a dozen bans that were issued against Ramchal and the group, and ultimately the study of Kabbalah. But the opposition was mainly in Central and Eastern Europe. And that's where there has to be an understanding of communal relationships. Ramchal and his group retained their authority in Padua. And they still had support in Mantua and elsewhere. But as far as the larger rabbinate, especially the Ashkenazic rabbinate, he had faced intense opposition. So, okay, I guess I'll just finish this part very quickly to say that he arrived in Amsterdam, and he in essence had a whole new existence once he arrived in Amsterdam. He got there in 1735. He stayed until 1743. Amsterdam was home to a very large Jewish community, both two separate communities really, an Ashkenazic community and a Sephardic community. This is called the Great Synagogue of the Ashkenazi community that was established in 1671. And over here is what's called the Esnoga, which still stands, and it was built in 1675. And Ramchal basically found a home in this building right here, which is called the Chaim Yeshiva. The Sephardic Jews of Amsterdam were Portuguese Jews, Western Sephardim, who had come out of the Iberian Peninsula at the very end of the 16th century and in the beginning of the 17th century. They made their way through France to Bordeaux and Bayonne and Bordeaux, and eventually to Amsterdam. And they then really became probably the wealthiest community wealthiest Jewish community in Europe at the time, if not in the world. And Ramchal found a home in the local yeshiva. The interesting thing about all of this is that two of his main opponents of the Ashkenazic rabbinate in Eastern Europe actually served as Ashkenazic chief rabbis, successive Ashkenazic chief rabbis in Amsterdam during his tenure there. He had arrived, he lived quietly, he was separate, he no longer in essence attempted to present himself in any messianic way or even teach Kabbalah. And so two of his opponents who had sort of been promoted and gotten this wonderful job as chief rabbi of Ashkenazic community in Amsterdam, they didn't pursue him during the same time that they were in Amsterdam, because that was in essence, the controversy was primarily about his overt messianism. As long as it was suppressed or as long as he was quiet, that kind of controversy ceased to exist. The thing about Ramchal in Amsterdam, though, is that it wasn't that he simply gave up, because there's something quite interesting. This, by the way, is when he first arrives. You can see his name. You got he had come from a wealthy family in Italy, but he needed charity when he arrived. Here, this is an evidence that he had sort of joined one of the yeshivot. But over time, he actually he rose in status among the Sephardic community, and even received a prominent place, a seating place in the Esnoga, in this wonderful grand synagogue. He also ultimately, because he had originally he was a poet, he wrote something that ultimately was used in the local liturgy. But most famously, during this time, he made himself, in essence, into a sort of more mainstream rabbinic teacher. And one of the books that he wrote was one of the things that was really what Rabbi Gabai mentioned when he first introduced me, which was Mesilat Yesharim. This is this pietistic work. It is a Musar. Israel Salanter had turned it into sort of one of the foundational texts for the Musar movement in Lithuania. And Ramchal no longer was writing Kabbalah, and he wasn't publishing Kabbalah. And as I had said, he was no longer controversial. As much as that sounds sort of neat, it's more complicated than that. And that's one of the wonderful things about trying to understand Ramchal and his life, which was this. The image on the right is the handwritten manuscript that we know that he wrote in 1738. This was the book that was ultimately published in 1740, that was republished, that I had mentioned to you, that was republished so often in the 19th and 20th centuries. But I want to read one thing just with you to understand what his attitude was. I should just go back. Mesilat Yesharim reads now as sort of a very clear, almost stern outlook in terms of this, the rabbi saying, this is how we should live our life. This is you do the best you can under these circumstances, but this is a way to rise in terms of your piety. However, the context in which he actually wrote it, the original, was a dialogue. Instead of a monologue as we would understand and as we know it today, it was a dialogue between a chassid and a chacham. The chassid being a pietist, much like himself, and the chacham being a prototypical rabbi, who he had been struggling with and against for much of his life. So even though he was now living as a sort of a quietist, a quiet person off to the side, his original version of Mesilat Yesharim was quite distinct. And it was almost autobiographical. And it begins this way. He has a narrative at the very beginning. Whenever the chacham, he's describing this chacham, who is this great rabbi, but something is wrong. He feels something's wrong. Whenever the chacham would see these pietists, the spirit within him would become agitated, and he would ask himself, what are these people doing? What do they ponder? What insights do they have? How is it that in their souls are satisfied and their intellect tranquil within them? How is it that they are not impelled by disquiet or moved by discontent to seek to know, to search for understanding? The 20 Psalms they recite each day seem more than enough to set their thoughts calmly at rest. I, however, am always troubled concerning wisdom and knowledge, and my passion for new knowledge allows me no sleep. I find no satisfaction whatsoever in anything but intellectual investigation and comprehension of premises that are substantiated and verified. In other words, Ramchal is describing this rabbi, this Chacham, as somebody who is a deep intellectual, but who doesn't quite understand spirituality. And this, if you're going to take this back to what his life was in Padua, and what the controversy was really about, which was that he was saying, there is a spirit here, and it's a messianic moment. The spirit allows for the messianic moment. And if you're only thinking in terms of what is conventional, then you're going to miss it. So the Chacham continues to say to himself, oh, that I could sit down with one of them just once for 2 or 3 hours to hear what he has to say, to find out what knowledge he has acquired for all his seclusion and for all the books of the pietists that he is always reading. Now imagine, from the Ramchal's point of view, he's making this person into be extremely superficial. Imagine that you're going to understand everything about somebody or an entire group within just 2 or 3 hours. But this is how Ramchal is presenting it. For I cannot imagine what knowledge he discovers in them. In all the days, I never wasted a single hour over those books, nor did I ever desire in the least to see them. For I knew that I would gain no wisdom from them. In other words, he's saying that the rabbi, the Chacham, will never understand, or that the Chacham's attitude is that there's nothing really to understand from the Chassid. These people have these books in their hands from morning to night, as if they have never before heard that a person should be righteous, upright, or faithful, and should not be evil or commit transgressions. By my life, I have a great desire to listen to one of them, so that I may not know what satisfies his soul and quenches his thirst. In other words, what he is saying in this early version of Mesilat Yesharim is that the Chacham is assuming he can just quickly, that the Chassid will never understand what he is doing, but I can quickly understand what a pietist is doing. Just I want to have a quick conversation with them. But the way the book then shifts is that suddenly the Chacham meets a Chassid who was somebody he knew as a child. And the interaction basically goes like this. The Chacham says, tell me what you know. And the Chassid says, there's nothing to say. Why don't you tell me, you teach me what you have learned? And the Chacham then says, well, you could never possibly understand all that I know because I have all the years that I've studied. And the Chassid says, oh, okay, but I do have a question. What does it mean to love God and to fear God? And the Chacham then replies, oh, it's simple. We learn as when you're 5 years old, you learn the you learn that you're supposed to love God. And the Chassid says, so what does it mean? And Ramchal is actually saying this. The intricacy of it, how it happens, is fascinating. And he's saying, tell me what this means. What does it mean to actually love God? If you have this assumption, it doesn't mean that you can actually tell me. And the Chacham at that moment suddenly becomes a student. And then the rest of Mesilat Yesharim is exactly this, where the Chacham is learning from the Chassid and understanding that although he pursued all these things, he pursued knowledge, he never understood the soul. The reason I'm bringing this in is because for Ramchal and what that controversy was, he never gave up on that drive. And he never, although he didn't manifest, he didn't attempt to show himself as any messianic way in Amsterdam. This was something that he wrote and wanted to publish. When it came time to actual publication, he was advised, again, because of this issue of the controversy, that he had to change this. And so then because it's clearly critical about the rabbinate, it's clearly critical about what the understanding is, what a conventional understanding of what the rabbinate is and what society, what Jewish communal life is like. And therefore, what we have today is in fact a redacted version. And if you study the original version, it actually makes much more sense and is much more palatable. And the fact is that even though Ramchal was fine and did well in Amsterdam to a certain extent, and there's sort of the intricacies itself, that would be a lecture itself, he was still unsettled. And in 1743, even though he had risen to popularity within the community, he left and he went to the land of Israel. He went to Akko, and his life there is somewhat of a mystery, to such an extent that I'm going to skip that. There are supposedly 2 places that he's buried. He died in 1746 or 47. In Tiberia is where there's the usual assumption, in Tiberias, He's buried next to Rabbi Akiva, which works with the sort of idea that Ramchal saw himself as a reincarnation of Rabbi Akiva. This is sort of on the top of the hill of Tiberias, if you've ever been there. But also near Akko, which is where he lived his 3 years or so in Israel, in the land of Israel. He was buried in a place called Kfir Yassif. Jews in Akko generally were buried in Kfir Yassif if they could be, if they could afford it. And so this personality, this individual who I started this lecture, talking about the difference between Ramchal as we understand this image and the person that we, sort of developed, and the actual person, we're left with some of that same mystery because we don't actually know which places he buried in. And it itself also gets sort of complicated as to what the possibilities are. In any event, I've spoken much longer than I was expecting, but I'm very happy to hear any comments and questions and anything at all. So thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, David. It's Richard.
Hi.
So, I mean, there's two things. First of all, at what point was it during the Ramchal's time in Amsterdam? Hacham Tzvi Ashkenazi was run out of Amsterdam, or was that?
That was 30 years before, 20 years before.
Okay.
That was 20 years before. But that was also related to Sabbatianism and Nehemiah Chayon.
Yes.
And this Portuguese community had supported this Sabbatianist. The thing about Ramchal showing up is they didn't support him as a Sabbatianist. He wasn't overtly regarded as that. The question is, what did they actually know about him? He just showed up based on the records. He shows up with possibly a friend. There's somebody there. His name is Yehuda Mendola, who was a rabbi in Mantua. And they gave charity because this is the Portuguese Jews did that frequently. There were many people coming from Central and Eastern Europe who were frequently destitute. And he somehow ingratiated himself mainly because of his knowledge, I think. And then what he ended up writing while he was sitting in this Eitz Chaim yeshiva were sort of introductions to Judaism. So any of the question as to whether Portuguese Jews were aware or thinking about anything connected to Sabbatianism or anything that had happened with Chacham Tzvi, as you're bringing up, that's an open question.
My second question is that, well, I guess it's kind of more of a statement, but this time in the Jewish world was a time of messianism, right? I mean, we had Shabtai Tzvi 30 years before the birth of I Frozen? No, 30 years before the Lutzato, and then afterwards we have the affair with Yaakov Emden and Yonatan Eberschutz.
Right. So that's all of these things are a part of this concern of a Sabbatianism, and the question is how to define it. It's not that there's constant messianism. Sabbatianism is not messianism per se, not in these controversies. Shabtai Tzvi saw himself and was seen as the Messiah, and it was the major Jewish messianic moment and movement, maybe ever, if you really think about it, except for maybe Bar Kochba. After he converted, that burst the bubble, and yet it still persisted for some. Then he died 10 years later in 1676. That burst other bubbles, but it still persisted. And what showed up over time was sort of a pietism connected to Kabbalah, involved in an intricacy about something Kabbalistic that had virtually nothing to do with Shabtai Tzvi himself. The thought sometimes was that Shabtai Tzvi himself, that there was a reincarnation of Shabtai Tzvi. Was he going to return? The Eibschitz Emden thing was it wasn't even Emden. It was more the concern about Eibschitz and what it meant that he was writing these amulets that seemed to have some Sabbatian leanings or some Sabbatian origins. But it didn't mean that Eibschitz himself was thought in terms of Shabtai Tzvi, or that he thought, sometimes it had an issue as to what you were supposed to think about when you prayed. Like if you have this Sephardic tree, what are you praying to? Keter or Tiferet? It's a whole, and the issue is, this is really a time period of just messiness. It's not messy. It's not a time period of messianism. It's really a time period of messiness. There's no clarity from virtually any point of view. And this controversy about Ramchal is a perfect example, because he and the main members of the group in Padua, they were the rabbinate of Padua. There was a chief rabbi, his name was Shabtai Marini, but Shabtai Marini's son was part of the group. And Ramchal and the others all had ordination from either Shabtai Marini or somebody else, from, in there. They were connected to the rabbinate of Mantua. These are major places. I mean, Padua had an ancient history, their history and their rabbinate went further back than Venice. Meir Katzenellenbogen was from there. I mean, so that the idea that he's just a kid who, how could this possibly be? And, we're going to suppress him. It makes sense from the point of view of Moshe Hajiz. And if we were to talk, about each of them and who was involved, like, makes sense from the point of view of Ashkenazic rabbis and rabbinates in Central and Eastern Europe. But when you start to compare the rabbinates and compare the relationships, and Venice is a perfect example, where even within Venice, you have this political, it doesn't even work out. You have a couple of rabbis, a part of what's called the Yeshiva Klalitu, or that's sort of the Venetian rabbinate, even though there's really no such thing. But anyway, some of them who initially were opposed to Ramchal, and then over time they thought, this isn't working, something's wrong here. And they then sort of turned against each other. So even within Venice, there was a concern. It really is an enormous period of messiness. There happens to be that this last thing where I brought up, from Ramchal's point of view, his almost socio-religious point of view that you see in that original version, Mesilat Yesharim, that's like a diluted version of what he saw was supposed to be with Messianism. His Messianism was deeply Kabbalistic, deeply mystical in his own union with God, but he really wanted to reshape Jewish life socially and communally. And I published an article earlier in the year that deals with this exact thing, if anybody's interested. That to me is the crux of it. What is Messianism supposed to mean? Or what does it mean when we're talking about, real people? And so the fact that what he's describing in this dialogue between a Chassid and a Chacham, and that he sort of he changes the Chacham's mind, he wants to change the rabbi's mind. They should be more spiritual. They should be, more focused on what it means pietistically, to be what Judaism is supposed to be, in a pious sense.
David, I have a question.
Okay.
First of all, this was an amazing lecture.
Thank you.
And when we want to listen for another hour, that means that it's a really good one. So the question, I feel like I'm missing something in the story. And it sounds like this is a gifted person. This is like Ilui, somebody that reincarnation of Moses, all the background that you mentioned, and suddenly it stopped. And you will think that this thing should not stop, and they cannot stop, because if somebody is in this kind of level, it has to follow, it has to develop, it has to actually to come up and become one of the cornerstones of the Kabbalah, and like Ari and the people that he said he is. Was he was he really the person that he believed he was? And why did he basically left it? Because you don't have much of a choice when you're chosen like that.
So that's very well put. I would say, I think a couple of things. I hope I can say this well. The first is that you could have a genius who is born in a horrific position where nobody is there to cultivate it. And this happens all the time. There's no doubt in my mind. And that person, that's it. Who knows what happens to them? In the case of Ramchal, it's quite the opposite. It was cultivated, it was recognized, cultivated, promoted. His father supported him, and even to the extent that he ended up supporting the yeshiva and the whole thing. And he had a whole community behind him to a certain extent. It's not quite so simple, but it did work that way for him. To such an extent that he was so, I wouldn't be surprised if he thought when he was very young that he was already the reincarnation of Moses, that it made sense, Moses, that, marrying a woman named Tzipporah made sense, all of these things, to such an extent that with Yekutiel Gordon writing that letter, of course everybody is ready for this, because you know who I am. I mean, it's a very, in that sense, despite its genius, I mean, you can be a genius but still be naive. I think that's what happened there. The fact is that once the question is what he was doing in like 1734, what was in his mind, and what was he trying to do when he went to Venice to try to publish, when he made that move to Amsterdam. The thing about the move to Amsterdam is that it could have been that he was trying to start anew or start fresh or publish something. We know that his father he ran into some business troubles. He had a brother who had gone ahead. The real decision to go to Amsterdam is a hard one. It's a complicated one. It doesn't make a lot of sense. He talked about it for a whole year before he did it. And then he left in the dead of winter in what turned out to be one of the coldest winters of, decades. I mean, it was, but I do think that he continued to believe in himself as he had, but he evolved. The evolution is that he knew that it's the question of manifestation of himself. It's the question of manifestation of what he is attempting to meet and to bring about. So if you look at the very end of Mesilat Yesharim that is published now, he describes how this is for anybody. Everybody has the ability to reach this piety that he talks about, this chassidut that he talks about. Whether you have to work in some, business, or whether you have the opportunity, to engage in Torah study all the time. So I think that he matured in the sense that he didn't abandon himself or what he thought he was. He doesn't become a depressed person. He does new things. He shows up in Amsterdam and tries to teach. What I didn't say is that what Portuguese Jewish life was like. I mean, religiously, they were generally quite lax in their devotion. It's an incredible story in its own right, coming out of a converso background and all of that. And so he wrote these introductions to Judaism that were, I think, intentionally for this community that he was now a part of. But really, to get to your question, he had to have maintained that mystical side of himself. And the reason is because in 1743, at the height of his, not just comfort in the most cosmopolitan, wealthiest city in Europe, but he had a patron named Moshe Hajiz, who was one of the wealthiest members of the Portuguese community, who seems to have been enamored with Ramchal, and they seemed to have had this very close relationship. And Ramchal became close with the son. His name is Jacob, and he wrote what is now a very famous drama called La Yeshelim Tiyela, and it was published in 1743. He wrote this in honor of this wedding that Jacob de Chavez is I don't know if I had said Moshe Hajiz. I meant Moshe de Chavez. Sorry, Moshe de Chavez and Jacob de Chavez. He was now getting married, and so Ramchal published this drama in honor of the wedding. And that same year, he just picks himself up, and he leaves with his wife, and his son, and his mother. His parents had come to Amsterdam, but his father seems to have passed away. And they left and they went to Palestine, to the Ottoman Empire, to Eretz Israel, but to Akko of all places. Like they landed in Akko, which was a port, but he doesn't go to Jerusalem, where you have not only just what it is spiritually and historically, but the Orach Chaim had been. I mean, there's new stuff happening in Israel in the land of Israel at the time. He doesn't go to Tiberia. He doesn't settle in those places. He seems to have his own vision about what he is supposed to do and where he's supposed to be. And he goes to Akko, where there is a community, but barely. And there's clearly something going on that doesn't really fit with any particular trend. It's not just a trend that he goes to the land of Israel. There's something else. Why does he step in Akko and only in Akko? Like it's a funny thing, which is why your question is so good. And I don't know that I can really answer it beyond sort of what seems to me is that the wheels are turning, but what it means, I don't know.
Thank
I want to ask something. Well, following on that question, first of all, thank you for trying to explain to us this complex personality.
Thank you for listening. I hope I'm trying.
It seems like you were focusing on his life in Europe, but then he like you just mentioned, you're going to Akko, and at the end of the day, Akko is a big thing in his life because he opened a synagogue, he writes the Sefer Torah. This is famous synagogue. I've been there with a sunken bima and all that. So, like you just said, he was starting something completely new, but then he passed away, I guess. But the focus of all the stories about the Ramchal is in Europe.
Yes.
How is that?
Okay. There are two main reasons. I can give you a historical reason and then another understanding for the historical reason. The historical reason mainly might be that the evidence, like the actual material that we can go on, is his life in Italy and elsewhere. But there's another reason, which is that those who study history generally haven't looked. How do I put this?
I register.
Let's say we look at Ramchal and we see him in Italy, and we see him in Amsterdam, and we see him in Akko. The people who usually what you have for scholars who study early modern Jewish history, which is what this is, they don't go from one place to this place to another place. There's a big difference between Italy and Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam, and certainly Jews in the Ottoman Empire. So the material that I've come up with about Ramchal in Amsterdam, nobody ever found it before. Nobody even really was concerned with it because the people who were interested in, let's say, the Kabbalah of Ramchal or the poetry of Ramchal, like they didn't necessarily, they're coming from very different perspectives, and they're not looking at the biography and how this person evolves. And the people who look at Portuguese Jews aren't thinking of like going through the archives to try and find, the needle in a haystack about Ramchal. And it ultimately then goes to the same issue with Ramchal showing up in Akko. There have been some articles trying to understand what do we know about Ramchal in Akko. And it's mainly come down to that there are only two sources that refer to him. One is it's this document that was published that was printed, a single document, single page, or it's two sides of a single page, that was printed by, where the rabbis of Kfir Yassif are asking for money. And one of the things that they say is they're like talking about, the importance of their community. And we are close to the Galilee, and these are the people that are buried nearby, these famous rabbis. but it's a funny way of saying it because the people that it mentions who are close by, who are buried, the famous rabbis buried nearby, they're not really nearby. They're sort of like throughout the Galilee. They're not like right there in Kfir Yosef. They're all over the place. And Ramchal is mentioned there, except that he's actually referred to as Chaim Moshe Lutzato, because they don't actually necessarily know him. It's a hard thing to decipher exactly what, but he's included among these others. And the other source is a hesped, is a eulogy from the rabbis of Tveria, saying the Butzina Kadisha, the Kabbalist Moshe Chaim Lutzato was died in a plague. And in dying in this plague, here this horrible thing has happened, and his entire family was wiped out, and now he's buried in Tveria. So you have these two different places, seemingly that he is possibly buried. But the issue then is, well, what else do we know about him, and how are we supposed to try and figure this out? Like, what do we know about his life there? But unlike in Italy, in Padua, and unlike in Amsterdam, I can't go to an archive. There's no archive to look and try and find his name. Unlike in the case of like all this stuff that I was talking about, like the difference between Moshe Chaim Lutzato and Ramchal, like this image of Ramchal. There, in that work, I was looking at printed books, like what was published, when was it published, and then trying to relate that. Well, suddenly I realized, okay, you know what? This has nothing to do with the individual, with the person, Moshe Chaim Lutzato. This is the work and what it becomes as it's received. So the issue then of trying to figure out what his life was between 1744 or 1743 and 1746-47 is really just comparing it to what else is going on. There's a reconstituted community in Tveria, meaning that there are now Jews who are coming back to Tveria, to Tiberias. And the amazing thing is that it's led by a Kabbalist named Chaim Abulafia. And the money, some of the money is coming from Jews to merchants in Venice who previously supported Ramchal. So they knew each other, but he doesn't go to Tveria. He stays in Akko. And the same thing, he doesn't go to Jerusalem. So the issue of trying to understand his life there really it's not even searching for a needle in a haystack anymore. It's more like trying to just figure out what is the context and what decision is he making and why is he making these decisions. And at that point, it's primarily speculation for the very end of his life. I don't know if that's a good answer.
Did he ever attempt to refute some of the claims against his Sabbatism and all that sort of stuff?
He did. He there are letters that he denied it. And that was when he was saying, these rabbis don't understand what we're doing. They don't understand who we are. Isaiah Bassan, who I had mentioned early on, he was the chief rabbi of Padua when Ramchal was a very young man. He got involved because Moshe Hajiz and some of the rabbis, especially in Venice, were very critical of Isaiah Bassan, saying, look what your student has done, look what he's doing, what is going on, you should, how do you account for this? And eventually Isaiah Bassan said, look, you have to understand there's a difference between Sabbatianism and pietism. It doesn't, just because you're a pietist and you're focusing in Kabbalah. I should make the point that, Moshe Hajiz and Yaakov Papers and they themselves were pietists, and they also studied Kabbalah. Kabbalah was there in the atmosphere. It was in the life. It was in the culture, and it was everywhere. The question was how it appeared for a person and what they did with it. So Isaiah Bassan said, just because it looks, he's talking about a Magid, maybe I don't. He even said himself, I don't think it's necessarily true, but it doesn't mean he's a Sabbatianist. And so, but when it came to, a person like Hajiz as an example, or a couple of the rabbis in Venice, their goal was to maintain order. And this didn't sound good. And I mean, rightfully, it doesn't sound good. A 23-year-old coming along and saying these things. You know, it would require a lot change. I see one question here. It says, at what point did he think he was a Gilgal of Moshe? That's a good question. I suspect I might have mentioned this. I wouldn't be surprised if he thought, if it sort of like popped into his head very early, like as an early adolescent. But by the time Kutiel Gordon is writing his letter, then it seems pretty clear by then.
David, I have one question, if I may.
Yes,
Maybe I missed something. But what was the purpose of Gordon's letter? What was he trying to achieve? It's like, you know, first of all, it seemed like he was writing to somebody he does not know,
Yeah.
and then he's saying all these things that will become controversial. I'm still confused. What's the purpose of it?
Okay, so I should mention that the two great scholars who worked on this stuff before me, Isaiah Tishby, Israeli scholar, and Elisheva Karlbach, who's at Columbia University and was my advisor, they both see this as coming from Ramchal himself, meaning he made the point like, okay, you can announce this now. And I think that's probably the case. What I think is happening is that he's looking, that Yekutiel Gordon, and if it's really coming from Ramchal, that they're looking for patrons. They're looking for support outside of Padua. And, you know, that letter that I read, he sort of finishes it by saying, you know, let me know if you want Ramchal to reveal things to you personally. He sort of presents it as, this is your opportunity. But it's weird. And he might have written others. We only have two. He might have written other, you know, to other people as well, trying to get a feel for this. But I think that what it really reflects is that the incredible confidence that they all had. I mean, Ramchal had unbelievable confidence. I mean, to the extent that there's arrogance when you see the things that he calls, you know, these great scholars and rabbis who are opposed to him. The confidence is, you know, he doesn't like have a shred of doubt. And then for a man like Yekutiel Gordon, who himself must have been impressive to arrive, like he's not a slouch coming from Vilna to go to study in Padua. And they must have just had total conviction. And now this is the announcement, so to speak.
I want to say something. It's getting late, and I have just 3 quick questions. Hopefully, it's quick answers. It seems to me that a major part of the puzzle here is his writing that were buried in Frankfurt, because this will shed a lot of light on what he was thinking genuinely before he was forced to shut down. So, was there any attempt to search for those writings?
I think so. I mean, I've sort of fantasized about coming across things under floorboards, but those are what was buried were the Kabbalistic stuff that we know have been mentioned before, like the Tikkunim and other things.
Mm-hmm. And the other question I have, which is not that important, but it's just for my curiosity, that little yeshiva next to the synagogue in Amsterdam, is that the chapel of today, the small chapel next?
Yeah, the Vintage synagogue. Yeah, that's that, and that. Yeah, so that's where presently it's the library and this part of what was the school. Much of that it didn't look the same then, but that was sure. That's where the Eitz Chaim was. Yeah,
it's cool because I did pray there for Kabbalat Shabbat almost a year ago.
Oh, okay, great.
In a beautiful place. And the last thing is, you mean this one?
Yes, that's it.
And all of these?
Yeah, very good.
Just making connection.
Thank you. Thank you. No, thank you.
Okay, I think I just want to say thank you on behalf of everyone.
Thank you for having me.
You've given an incredible talk. I must say there's a lot to digest for one night. You've shed a lot of light on a personality who I thought I knew a little bit about, and now I say clearly I knew nothing about. I even couldn't help myself and just turned around to open my Mesilat Yesharim and open up the introduction. And I just quickly scanned through it as you were talking, and it just, you've just changed the whole way I can read the introduction from the original one and the redacted version. It's just, how he talks to what a pious person should be and how he's relating some very basic things. I'm going to have to go through and read this again because you just put a whole different spin on things. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I also think it's incredible how, you hear about Chachamim, and you mentioned very briefly at the beginning, how you talk about great Talmidei Chachamim. And last week we heard about the Rambam, and this week we hear about the Ramchal. And you read the Sfarim and you just don't realize the amount of controversy surrounding their lives. And they didn't have it easy. And then years later, it becomes the Mesilat Yesharim, like the de facto sefer of Lithuanian, yeshivot, or the Rambam, or whoever it is. And it's so important to put the pieces together to actually appreciate that people don't necessarily have easy lives. And yet the cream always rises to the top, and the truth comes out at the very end. And I think that's an incredible chizuk and inspiration for us in today's day and age as well. So thank you on behalf of everyone.
Thank you.
Really, really beautiful. And we really appreciate your time and effort. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good evening.
Good night.